Um, so one housekeeping note. Next week is going to be lesson 8 and 9. Next week will be lesson 8 and 9. We're skipping lesson 7. And Brother Kaufman's going to be leading that study. So just, I know we had the sheets that said that, but just as a reminder, next week will be lesson 8 and 9. Tonight we're talking about Psalms 23, a very familiar psalm to most of us here. I will say that this is my first time leading a adult class discussion, so I'm very glad that Dane's walking into the auditorium right now. Because I know he's good for some very good comments that are very detailed, so but tonight we are going to be studying Psalms chapter 23. That's lesson 5 in your book. So just to jump right in it. So just a quick background on Psalms 23. It says in the Bible, the title is the Lord, the Shepherd of His People, a Psalm of David. The consensus for most people is that David is the author of this psalm. Though it is not 100% known, as your book points out, whether David is the author. Most believe that it is. Some people might say that the title could mean about or for David, and so it is written about him or for him. The idea is still the same, that when we get into the psalm and some applications we can pull from it. But going with the idea that David wrote it, then as the book talks about a little bit, the idea of whether he was younger or older, and what have been his motivation, whatever, if it would have been in a specific time of his life, whether he was, running from Saul or before he defeated Goliath. Again, we don't know, but these are my words. That is, it's an in-depth knowledge of the relationship combined with expressing their dependence on one greater, shows someone with experience and wisdom. So, just my opinion is that he's older. He's already lived the life of a shepherd when he was younger, and he's experienced some things in life. That's just my opinion. Anybody have any other thoughts or ideas about David and when he wrote it, or if he wrote it?
Maybe the form fits David better than any other character that you find in the Bible.
It does, and we're going to look at that here in a little bit. But yeah, it definitely does. If David did write it, then obviously he has the experience, and it means a lot more when you read it and you think about who wrote it and the words he's saying there. So the other thing about it that we see is a very personal psalm, whoever did write it. Use the word I and me and my about 17 times in these 6 verses. So it's definitely a psalm that's portraying a personal relationship between the sheep and the shepherd. And as your book points out, I don't have this on the slide, but as your book points out the structure of the psalm, the entire psalm speaks of God's shepherd role, that the psalm is divided into 2 parts: God's shepherd role, verses 1 through 4, and then him as a host in verses 5 and 6, and we'll talk about that a little later. But there's some discussion in the book about that idea of the host, but again, we'll talk about that later. But that's kind of the structure of the psalm. It's completely about God's role as the shepherd. So with that, let's go ahead and read the entirety of the psalm. Beginning in verse 1, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So what I want to do tonight beginning of our class, is to kind of look at the two characters that we see here in Psalms 23, that being the sheep and the shepherd, and look at those characters a little bit more in depth. But before we get to that, question number 2, as we start, what is the most important message in this psalm to you? Obviously, this is kind of more of a what you think type question, but what did somebody write down for this answer? Richard?
Care for his sheep, or the Lord's care for us.
Okay.
Well, you have a relationship. There's a relationship with the Lord. The Lord is my shepherd. The fact that he's with me and the fact that he's with us, I think that really says a lot.
All right. Ken, did you have a... He said it. All right. Stephen?
The absolute confidence that the writer has in God, and this confidence allows him to really overcome his fear of evil that may take him.
Yeah, those are all exactly right. I just put simply the message of our dependency on our trustworthy God. But y'all said it probably a little bit better than even I did. So with that, we're going to get into it. Again, the psalm is about God and his trustworthiness, our ability to completely depend on him, and we'll get into more of that as we go. So, kind of the character study, the sheep. So when you think about it, why sheep? Why does God compare us to sheep? Why not a tiger or a wolf or a deer or even a cow? But obviously, yeah, that's definitely true. They can't defend themselves, and we'll see that here in a minute. But when you first just read it, you think, oh, a sheep. But when you start breaking it down, as we will, there's definitely obviously a reason God picked this animal.
They're also not very bright.
Yeah, they're not very bright. Yeah, that's definitely true. We'll see that here in just a minute. So with that, what characteristics do sheep have that make, question number 3, what characteristics do sheep have that make them an excellent metaphor for the human condition? So we've said that they weren't very, very smart. They need to be led.
They're weak and vulnerable compared to the others around them.
Mm-hmm.
They're predators. They kind of need saving.
Yeah.
So if they get the jam, they can't get themselves out of it.
Which I guess makes it ironic that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. We're talking about this needy sheep. But here's a man who has a shepherd who is the Lord, and yet he has no want. And then he kind of presents his case with about 12 reasons throughout these verses that he says, here's why.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, that's a really good point. And we're going to look at that here a little bit later. But yeah, it's kind of we're compared to sheep in this passage. But like you said, the man writing it as a sheep is saying he doesn't need those things that we typically think of sheep needing. Did I see another hand?
Sheep are totally dependent on the shepherd. And this writer is saying that this shepherd, this Lord, has fulfilled all my needs. Food and water, safety, place to rest, and full of confidence that these things are being supplied.
They're also communal. They're not lone wolves. We don't do well on our own.
That's true. Yeah.
With the proper shepherding, they're very valuable. Sheep can be very productive when they have a good shepherd.
Good point. There you go.
I noticed the question asks, what characters do sheep have that make them excellent of a human condition? Speaking of us, but a lot of times, as we listen to the answers, and they're all great answers, we're still humans and they're sheep. Everything we're talking about, we're saying they. Whereas the writer made it I, me, my, me, he's kind of to be personal. And in essence, the question is asking us, do we see ourselves like that? Do we see ourselves as vulnerable? Instead of, well, I'm top of the food chain. I'm a rock. I'm a wolf. You know? I'm not no sheep.
Yeah.
We see ourselves as needy, vulnerable, need saving, like Stephen just said. Do we see ourselves like that? That's the personal idea the person is drawing at. Do I look myself in the mirror and say, no, I'm not a type, I'm not a bear. I'm a sheep that has gone astray and I need my God, who is my shepherd.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and hopefully here we're going to look a little bit more at some of the characteristics of a sheep. We'll draw some comparisons to us and try to answer this question a little bit better. So what I put, there's a unique relationship with its caretaker. It's, Stephen kind of pointed out, and some others. You don't see another animal like that has that kind of relationship with its caretaker, as we'll see in a little bit. As the gentleman said, our brother said, very social. They feel very safe in a herd, as we should feel safe with our family here at West Main. They are dumb. They're not very, very bright. In some ways, they're not very bright. I put that they're kind of directionless. They don't. We'll see. They don't follow. They don't have a good sense of where they're at in comparison to where they should be or where the shepherd is, and they're defenseless. So we're going to take a look at these real quick. So sheep are D-U-M, dumb is what I put. So in doing a little research, there was this news story from Turkey. It said hundreds of sheep followed the leader off a cliff in eastern Turkey, plunging to their deaths this week while shepherds looked on in dismay. So you can just see this idea. There was 400 sheep that fell 15 meters, that's about 50 feet. Just one right after another, just kept falling off, and they all died. Kind of the shocking thing about that is those 400 broke the fall of another 1,100 sheep that fell off the same cliff. So 1,500 sheep just with no. Well, they weren't thinking, obviously. So they just kept on walking and right off the cliff. So I guess glass half full, 1,100 of them were saved by the other 400. But it was interesting also in the story. It said it happened while the shepherds were eating breakfast. So obviously the shepherds weren't doing their job, and in the short amount of time that they were eating breakfast, 1,500 sheep went off a cliff. So they're not very smart animals.
We may laugh about it, but because we are ourselves before reality, you too, when we follow people blindly, reality too. So
Yep.
we fell without thinking, without examining the scripture, people always make a scripture.
No, you're right, and I'm going to get to that. You're getting ahead of me, which is fine, but we're going to get. It's completely okay. But we're going to get to some verses here in a minute that kind of bring all these things together. So we're not sitting here making fun of these animals, but there is a point for us to learn from these. So yeah, I have down here in my notes, the idea of for me to think about how do we compare spiritually. How dumb are we concerning the decisions we make sometimes spiritually. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So next point. Directionless. I don't see my wife in here. She's probably back there with Stella, but I won't get a look from her because I can't see her. So I personally don't have any issue with directions. I'm one of those people, like if I'm driving somewhere, if I'm the one driving there and I go there, like it's in my brain, I know how to get there. I'm good knowing north, west, east, south. Invariably, anywhere we go, when we come out, whether it's a hotel room, an elevator, a store, Heather will automatically start going the complete opposite way we're supposed to go. Sometimes it's several feet. I'll let her go before I'm like, we're supposed to go this way. Or I'll just stop and see and wait and see when she realizes I'm not right next to her. But so, the idea of needing directions, it's a little foreign to me because I'm pretty good with them, but I understand that it doesn't take long to get turned around and lose your bearing. if you're not paying attention. But sheep will wander. They'll eventually lose sight of where they are, and they'll just start wandering and get lost. As they're grazing on the grass, they're not looking up, they're not keeping a sense of their bearings, and they'll just wander off. It's interesting, though, they don't run off. Sometimes you think of like a dog or some other animals. They get loose like a horse, and they might just take off running. They're just gone. But sheep don't run. We'll see in a little bit. They're not very athletic, so they don't run. And it's just so my point to this is it's just a gradual, slow, but steady wandering away, which, again, we'll look at some verses, and that very much describes us as humans. A lot of times, it's just a slow, steady wandering. We'll get to that verse in a minute. When an animal is threatened, in general, there's three responses that animals usually have. There's fighting, but sheep don't have claws, they don't have fangs, or quills like a porcupine, or venom of any kind. They're absolutely defenseless. There's no way for them to fight back against somebody who's trying to hurt them. I mean, they just can't. The other thing animal will do is flight, so the fight or flight idea. So animals like a deer or something will just take off and run. Well, as I said earlier, sheep aren't very fast. They're not very agile. And when they have all that fur on, or wool on them, they're even slower. So they don't run either away like you would think of a deer or something like that, or a rabbit. And then there's posturing, which they don't do either. So think about a dog, barking, showing its teeth, growling, a cat hissing and arching its back. I have a rattlesnake, and how they coil up and they shake their rattle. A skunk, turn around, flare out its tail until you get away. A pufferfish, blowing itself up. All these ways are to kind of try to fend off or warn other animals to stay away from them. But sheep don't do that. All a sheep does is baa. They just make a noise. They herd together and they kind of run around, and hopefully they're not the one that gets picked off. So they don't have any way to fight back. They can't fight. They can't run away. They don't have any way to scare off an animal that's trying to hurt them. They're 100% defenseless. Maybe. So we've already talked about this a little bit. Now that we've looked at these, how does the psalm address human weakness? Question number 8. Kyle?
Without the Lord's help, we really are defenseless against the devil's attacks. It's God who gives us the guidance to know how to escape temptation. He provides a way of escape.
You wander because you don't know what's right, what's wrong. So it's
Yep. So how does this psalm address human weakness? So I put, the idea of helping them in time of need, making them lay down. So I put Romans 1:20 through 20. Hold on. Let me look at my notes real quick. That might be a typo. Well, I think I messed up this slide, but my thought here was in Romans 1:20 through 22, the idea that it says that they knew God, they knew who he was, but yet they didn't glorify him. Professing to be wise, they became fools. So the idea that, we're dumb. We sometimes as humans don't make good decisions. I mean, through the invisible attributes that God put here for us to see that there is a creator, it says that we know who he is, but yet we don't want to glorify him sometimes. And we profess to be wise and think we know what's best when we really don't. And so in a sense, well, not in a sense, it makes us dumb as a creature. It makes us dumb in the decisions we make spiritually.
God created sheep and he created me. And so he knows that this is a good analogy for me, that I am weak in many ways. And that comforts me because he knows exactly who I am, what my needs are, better than I even know myself. So I think in that sense it addresses human weakness, that my Creator knows those that are in me. He's made provision for every one of them.
Well, then I need a shepherd. I'm not a competent shepherd of my own life. I like the phrase, he makes me lie down in green pastures. On my own, I may not recognize a green pasture as a green pasture. I might think that living for self, doing what I want to do, calling shots, instant gratification, that's a green pasture. And so, but he says, no, that's a green pasture. What you thought was a green pasture, you're going to starve over there. I'm also reminded here, we have enemies. The table is prepared in the presence of my enemies. My struggle is against, and we all have people that have given us a hard time, but Paul reminded us, your struggle is against the world forces of wickedness in heavenly places. You've got some serious enemies out there.
Good point, Bud.
It's one of those same lines where we as humans, we don't know how stupid we are. If we could interview a sheep, they wouldn't know that they're that dumb. In that same manner, we have to discover that. And you start thinking, makes me lie down. Anyone with kids, when they get really tired, and it's like, you can take a nap. I'm like, no, I don't, I'm not tired. As a parent, you know better. But it's hard to convince them. And that's how we are even as adults sometimes in relation to God. And without, you were talking about the defenses earlier, without God's mercy, we have no defense. And once we've sinned, what else is there? Except His mercy, His grace, now we have that defense.
Good point. Linda. So to finish up this slide here, so I know what I was doing here. So number 2, he leads me to the idea of being directionless. In Jeremiah 10:39, our Lord, I know the way of man is not of himself. It's not for him to direct his steps. If it's up to us as mankind, spiritually, we're not going to go the right way. As the brother said, we're going to think, oh, this is a great green pasture. Makes me kind of think of Lot when he looked at the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah. He's like, oh, this is great. Well, it didn't turn out very great for him and his family. So sometimes we need to be led to the right place. And then number 3, your rod and your staff comforts me, being defenseless. Just as a reminder, 1 Peter 5:8-9, it says that the devil walks around as a roaring lion, seeking who he can devour. So he's a lion, we're a sheep. Lion's going to win 100 times out of 100, unless we have a shepherd to protect us.
Another thing I read about sheep is that sometimes they have to be disciplined, and the rod and staff can be used as a line of discipline as well as fending off enemies. So sometimes you can be disciplined.
Yeah, I read in some research that people said to an extreme measure, if you had the same sheep that was wandering off a lot, a shepherd sometimes would break the sheep's leg on purpose and then would carry it around on its shoulders until it mended, and after that sheep would never leave the shepherd's side. It was a way for them to kind of train the sheep to, if they had one that was really bad, to kind of get it to learn who they needed to trust. I don't know how true that is, but I read that in a couple of different places, so that's pretty extreme. going to read this. Sister Linda handed me this. It's from the book A Shepherd Looks at Psalms 23 by Philip Keller. It's a quote from that book on page 20 through 21. It says, "It's no accident that God has chosen to call us sheep. The behavior of sheep and human beings is similar in many ways, as will be seen in further chapters of his book. Our mass mind or mob instinct, our fears, our timidity, our stubbornness, our stupidity, our perverse habits are all parallels of profound importance. Yet despite these adverse characteristics, Christ chose us, buys us, calls us by name, makes us his own, and delights in caring for us." So as we see, getting into the idea of the shepherd now, it is only because of the shepherd that we have a hope of life. So real quickly, I was told Stephen I wasn't sure if I was going to have enough material, and now I'm looking at the clock and I might have too much, but so we'll kind of just touch on this real quick. The idea of the shepherd would have been very familiar to the nation of Israel. If you go back to Genesis chapter 46, some good detail about the patriarchs and the early nations of Israel, and that they were nomadic herdsmen. I believe that's when they were coming into the land of Goshen, and talking about them settling there and having the sheep and all the herds that they would have. You look at Abraham, and that look at all the herds he had as a shepherd, and he gained in wealth, obviously, as he got older. But example I put up there is Genesis chapter 14, when he goes to save Lot from the kings of Sodom. So here's the shepherd, but yet a shepherd that shows great leadership and courage and the ability to fight. A lot of times people, as your book points out, people think a shepherd is kind of a timid, kind of gentle job. When if you look at these examples in the Old Testament, it's quite contrary to that. It's a very rough job, and sometimes it was a job that was despised and wasn't looked at very highly. Jacob, in Genesis chapter 31, talking to Laban, he says, paraphrasing, that the life of a shepherd was hard. It took dedication and determination. He's telling Laban, "These are all the stuff. It's all the stuff I've done for you. If I've lost sheep, I've repaid it. I've fought off lions. I've protected the sheep." And he's just pointing out it's a pretty good passage that's describing kind of the life that he had to live as a shepherd.
You're having to fight off a lion. Your life is in danger too. You're laying your life on the line for the sheep.
Yeah, absolutely. Moses, if you look at him, he was a shepherd for his father-in-law in Midian when God comes to him. So he obviously understood the job from a physical standpoint and what it took. But God comes to him and asks him to kind of be an emotional and spiritual leader, a spiritual shepherd for the people of Israel, to lead the flock out of Egypt. And it's kind of an interesting study at the beginning in Exodus. There's some of the verses where he's talking to God. He's basically telling God, "Send someone else. I can't do it. You have the wrong person." And to the point where it says that God gets mad at him, and tells him, "No, you are going to do it." But it's interesting at the end in Numbers 27, before he dies, when he goes up onto the mountain and God's showing him the promised land, he asks God, who's going to take over and be the leader of the nation. So he was wanting to know who's going to be the next shepherd, if you will, and lead the nation of Israel. So we obviously see Moses was a great example of a shepherd for the people of Israel. And then, of course, David. I think your book points this out somewhere about his occupation as a young man, and then he delivered the flock of Israel from the danger of Goliath, using the tools that a shepherd would use, the sling. So this is something that the Israelites would have known very well. It was a term used by the Israelites to describe a leader. Jacob used it in describing Jehovah in Genesis chapter 48 and 49. It's given as a title to the kings, especially David, this idea of shepherd. In 2 Samuel 5:2, it says, "In the past, when Saul was our king, you were the real leader in Israel. The Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people. You will shepherd my people Israel. You will rule over Israel." And it was the name obviously given to the coming Messiah. David was a type of this in Ezekiel 34. It says, I will set one shepherd over them, and he will feed them, namely my servant David. He will feed them and be their shepherd. And of course, talking about Christ in Micah, the same idea that he will stand and feed the flock and be the strength of the Lord. In the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall abide. So this idea wasn't lost on Israel. It was something that was part of their occupation, part of their history, part of their culture. So they knew this idea of shepherds and sheep very, very well. So getting into the psalm itself and looking at the verses, it's already kind of been pointed out, but if we believe the author's David, and we believe that he was maybe older in his life when he wrote this, reflecting back, then he would have possibly been king of Israel. And so he writes this psalm not as a viewpoint as a leader, as the shepherd, but as the dependent sheep, looking at his shepherd and the blessings that come with him. And as your book points out, this isn't let me try to make sure I quote it the right way. Where is it? The book just points out that it's a psalm of complete trust. You know, he's stating these things as fact, like these do happen with my shepherd, and he's obviously writing it from the point of a sheep. So with that, let's look at verses 1 through 3 of Psalms 23. The idea there is that there's no lack of physical necessities. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. You look at parallel passage in Luke chapter 12, 22 to 32, that's talking about the birds of the air, the ravens of the air, and the lilies of the field, and how God takes care of them. And so isn't he going to take care of you that much more as man? And the idea of making me to lie down in green pastures, the book makes a point, says it's an interesting fact about sheep. They will not lie down when they are hungry, but when they have eaten and are full, they will lie down in the abundant grass. So it's just pointing out that sometimes the sheep have to be kind of disciplined and told, lie down here and rest. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. And then he leads me beside the still waters. Again, in Revelations 7 through 17, it says, for the Lamb who is in their midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of water. I don't think we'll have time tonight, but towards the end of the stuff I talked about, it's very interesting the parallel with Jesus, that he's obviously called our good shepherd in chapter 10 of John, and then here in so many other places he's talked about the Lamb, being the Lamb. So again, it's that idea that we have a Savior who understands both aspects, being the shepherd and also being the Lamb, and realizing where we're coming from. So in these first 3 verses, again, it's the idea of no lack of physical necessity. He's going to take care of all of our daily physical needs, and we don't have to worry about that. Anybody have any comments or ideas or questions or anything?
You know, I think it's the I shall not want is a really important principle. That is, that to really buy into that. I think so many people are afraid. If I become a Christian, there's things I've got to give up. Am I going to miss out? And Satan is constantly telling us, you're going to miss out. And I think if you can have that mentality, if I follow God, I'm not going to miss out. I think that makes you stronger against temptation. I think when we think we're missing out, we get nervous or vulnerable.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and jump forward to this slide, and we'll go back. But to your point, this idea of I shall not want, this is not original to me. I found this, so these are not my thoughts. But the idea of I shall not want for rest, for he makes me to lie down in green pastures. I shall not want for peace, for he leads me beside the still waters. I shall not want for forgiveness. It says later that he restores my soul. I shall not want for guidance, for he guides me in the paths of righteousness. I shall not want for companionship. David says here, as the sheep, that you are with me. For comfort, your rod and your staff comfort me. I shall not want for provision, for thou prepared a table before me. For joy, which I thought was a one I hadn't thought of specifically, but you anointed my head with oil and my cup runs over. I guess to me that it's not a language I use a lot, terminology I use a lot, so it wasn't necessarily the first thing I thought of, but when I read it, it jumped out to me. I appreciated that point. And then, shall not want for everything in time, for goodness and mercy shall follow me, and everything in eternity, for I dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So, to your point, if we allow God to be our shepherd, we're not going to want for anything, whether physical or spiritual. He's probably upset with me back there, but. I just wanted to go ahead and jump to that while we were talking about it. Okay. So we no lack for physical necessities in verses 1 through 2. And then verse 3 says, restores my soul, who leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So here I think the idea is he restores my soul. In Revelations 3:19, it's the idea of as many as I love, I'm going to chase and rebuke and chasten. Sorry, I could say that the right way. But so God's going to be active in bringing us back to him if we allow it. And then he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. I think Kyle brought this up, 1 Corinthians 10, about no temptation being too big for us to bear. We have a way of escape. So God provides these things for us in a spiritual matter as well, or spiritual needs as well. Any comments or anything?
Just think about that last part, for his name's sake. You think that it has anything to do with the glory that it brings to God whenever we're following those paths of righteousness that he's leading us in? Is really his glory.
You're asking me that? Oh. I would think so. I mean, if I can promote my lesson from Sunday night, I mean, I think that's part of why God created us, was to glorify him. So if he's given us an opportunity to do that, and he sees that his sheep are doing that, I think that he's
Glorifies the shepherd.
He glorifies the shepherd, that the sheep are following his direction.
I think it's a thought that he will always do the right thing. He's always consistent with who he is. Even if no one appreciates it, even if only one person on the planet takes him up on his offer, he will still fulfill every promise to that one individual, because that's who he is.
Yep, that's a good point.
Even when he delivered Israel out of captivity, it was for his glory. So I think it's going back to what you were saying. It was always going back to him, who he is. So there's something there for us to learn.
Kyle.
This is making me think about what Jesus told his apostles when he sent them out in Matthew chapter 10. Verse 16, he said, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And this shows us how these metaphors aren't necessarily intended to describe every aspect of who we are. Jesus was telling his apostles here, in a sense, they'd be like sheep, but in another sense, maybe like serpents, in another sense, maybe be like doves. But as you go through the remainder of that section, you see that it was because of God's provision for them that they could go out into the world
What, that was in, what did you just say? Okay, so moving on, verses 4 and 5, I think talking about the idea of the shepherd's protection. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So, again, the idea is you're not going to fear anything because he's with you. The Lord's with you. He's there to help you and assist you, in navigating these times of question and possible fear that we might have in our lives. And then his rod and his staff comfort me. As pointed out already, these are going to be used to defend the sheep from danger, so you know that you have someone there to protect you. Makes me think of, the idea of putting on the whole armor of God. We have the ability to protect ourselves with God. And to Linda's point, sometimes it's got to be used, turned around and used on the sheep, right? So we know that they have dual purpose. But here it's the idea of protecting us and defending us from danger that we can't defend ourselves from, which obviously would be Satan and his desire to destroy us.
You know that David was exceeding rich as servants. I mean, he didn't lack anything. He had plenty of soldiers to defend him, to protect his life. And yet, he didn't satisfy all those things of the earth and set himself on, depending on God for every living thing. So we should focus our minds on the earth, focus our minds on the spiritual things. Things that are more God.
Good point, Eli. And then verse 5, the idea of physical protection, as a brother pointed out, in the presence of our enemies. We have enemies. It's something that we have to be aware of, but with God, we know we can face that. And then the same idea of anointing our head with oil and covering us over. Real quick, we'll go through these last ones. The last verse. All the days of one's life. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And then, as we kind of already looked at, the idea of forever. That if I do that and I trust in our shepherd, I will have be able to dwell in his house forever.
In spite of Saul and Absalom, and even at the very end, another son that David had to deal with, David says, my cup overflowed. And on a certain level, you might question, I know what David looks like. In certain aspects, you had a really hard, difficult life. But I think the reality is that there's going to be aspects of all our lives that we get hard and difficult. But his attitude was, I was very, very blessed. And I think that it's a challenge of living a Christian life of all you go through is as you're moving towards the end of it, my cup overflows.
Good point. Thank you all for your attention. Hopefully we got some good things out of this from God's Word. Thank you.